So now I'm going to take you through the all-important risk mitigation phase and the requirements around that. And then after that, we will look at the role of certification and how to treat certified material as part of your due diligence system. So we start by kind of summing up the main requirements around mitigation. So the regulation effectively requires you to mitigate risk prior to placing products on the market. The objective of the risk mitigation is to lower any risk identified to negligible. So the higher the risk, we say the more effort that is likely needed to reduce the risk. But sometimes I don't like necessarily saying higher risk, because I think that masks what it actually is, and what it is potentially multiple risks in different areas. And it's those multiple types of risk that actually can prove the challenge in mitigating. You know, that there may be a medium risk of harvesting without a license, and there may be a high risk of harvesting without a license. But whether it's medium or high in your mind, it's kind of irrelevant. The risk exists, so you have to mitigate it. But there may be risks of harvesting without a license, but there may be also, you know, forest management plans are out of date or not properly implemented. It may be you know, environmental regulations aren't followed. It may be health and safety regulations aren't followed, and that's where it gets complicated, because different measures are going to be needed to address those different things. So we like to talk in terms of like level of effort required. And that's what sort of brings me on to the second point there, in that the better you understand the risk, so the more you're able to specify the risk, and by that I mean like detail what exactly it is, like the examples I've just given, the easier it is for you to select the appropriate mitigation action, and also, you know, that more than one mitigation action may be required, and that mitigation might be ongoing. It might not just be a one-off thing, so you need to think of kind of your future how you're going to address risk into the future, because if it exists now, doing an audit now may not prevent something happening in a year's time or 2 years' time. So then the other thing to say is that you need to document and justify the effectiveness of the measures you select or implement. So why did that audit mean you then decided it was low risk? It's not enough just to say I did an audit. Say I did an audit and therefore these things were closed and I consider them low risk. I think that's everything on that slide. Okay, so I'm just going to go through various mitigations options open to you, and talk about perhaps how they might be used in combination as well. Right, new poll. I'm going to share this poll, just make sure everyone's still awake, you've had your afternoon coffee and you're not suffering from a post-lunch slump. Right, the poll should be open. And coming to you. There you go, a few of you voting. Just going to wait for a few more people to respond. Okay, closing the poll. And sharing the results. Okay. Interesting. So I think what that poll really was, the message trying to get over, is that all of those things listed there constitute a mitigation action. It's not to say they're the only ones, but they're some of the common ones. So, you know, they all need to be part of your system of, and the options you have to hand when mitigating risk. Right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about mitigation, we talk in terms of kind of avoiding the risk. So, you know, doing things up front that mean that you don't expose yourself to risk, and then controlling the risk. So quite a few of you, didn't select changing suppliers or supply chain. That was the least kind of voted for option, and I think that's probably because it's normally the last resort, but it does, you know, need to be factored in, especially if you know, adjusting your supply chain might be possible, but replacing your supplier may not be something that you come to immediately. That might be something you do as a last resort, but it does need to be considered. There's other things, like conducting training of suppliers or sub-suppliers. There's audits, collecting information. So you need to think of these in all of these as potential options. Now we're just going to pick a few of those and go into them in a bit more detail. So collecting additional information, if you remember back to the kind of access to information requirements of the regulations, not having certain information constitutes a non-compliance and a risk, non-compliance to the regulation, and therefore a risk in itself. So if you're missing species or country of harvest or other evidence that is like required by the regulation, then you need to request that, and that's sort of some of the most basic mitigation kind of actions that are needed. But there's other types of information and beyond just the basics, basic requirements. So that might include documents, and I think this is the mitigation action that most operators sort of gravitate to first. But then there's other sources of information that we need to take into account. So there's stakeholder consultations. They're really important, and quite often they often are done in tandem with a supplier audit or verification. And then there's timber testing, which is really useful in certain circumstances. It does have its limits, and you do sort of need to understand when it can be applied and how to interpret the results. But particularly around things like the risk of mixing in composites, if you have tested for the species in your composite and that gives you the list of species, then the risk of mixing with an unknown species is mitigated because you can show that. For anyone who's interested in finding out more about timber testing, we've got an article that goes into the different types of tests and how to apply them. And you can access that by the EUTR.info website. And if you scroll down, you'll see it there. I really recommend taking a look at that. It does also include information on labs that can do these types of tests, and a kind of a rough guide to pricing in there as well. The other thing is, and I think this is also a more common mitigation activity, is a dialogue with suppliers and clarification. Open lines of communication with your suppliers are super important. From reading a document in a foreign language to understanding kind of their sourcing practices, who they source from, that sort of thing. If you've got an MDF producer that you're sourcing from in China, understanding where they're getting their material from is going to help you with things like the risk of mixing, that sort of thing. So when would relying on documentation or requesting additional documentation be a kind of appropriate risk mitigation action? So it's when there is a risk specific to the absence or validity of a required document. So if there's a risk of harvesting without an annual harvest permit, then you can see that there's a value in asking to see the annual harvest permit, so you can close that risk. Risk of operating under an invalid forest concession agreement, again, you can see why that's valuable to kind of look to be able to see that, and the risk of operating under an outdated forest management plan. However, if the risk was a risk related to harvesting within protected areas, you could see that relying on a documentation or document for that in a lot of cases probably wouldn't be appropriate. In that case, kind of field observations are more relevant. So when you're asking for additional information, you need to be clear as to why that information is going to close that specific risk, and is it sufficient? Bearing in mind, sometimes levels of governance in a country may mean you can rely a greater or lesser extent on the validity of a document. That comes back to some of Chloe's slides earlier around information integrity and in the information collection phase. So replacing or changing supply chains. So you may, in some cases, decide to work with your suppliers to change the species from a high risk to a lower risk. You may change the structure of supply chains in terms of sub-suppliers. So if it's particularly complex and sourcing from lots of different places, or if that's continually moving and shifting, that can make things really difficult and increase risk. So there's potentially simplifying supply chains and fixing them as well. But that might require you to address the causes for why supply chains are structured in that way. If price is a big factor or something like that. So it's understanding sort of why supply chains may be ever changing. You may choose to exclude particular countries that you decide are just too high risk and require too much effort to source from. And the same goes for regions or sub-regions of harvest. And the last one, which I think for a lot of companies is one of the main options available to them, is choosing to source certified. And like I said, I'll come to treatment of certification in the next section. So here's a case study of a example where we were involved in the sort of changing the structure of a supply chain. There was the blue dot in the middle is a sawmill and an exporter that was sourcing from a number of different areas within, and that had a certain radius, 100k radius around their sawmill, and there was a well-known risk of harvesting inside protected areas, and there was a protected area that overlapped, and the solution was to exclude that sawmill from their sourcing. Sorry, I said the blue dot at the beginning was the sawmill. They weren't the kind of aggregator from a number of different sawmills, and that particular sawmill that was excluded was at risk from sourcing from a protected area. So changing procedures, and so this may be, there's opportunity to kind of share the work with suppliers, and there's a number of things that they can do before selling the product to you. So they can, having procedures in place with your suppliers, that they provide you with certain documentation and they collect that information through their own kind of business processes. They may agree to do certain checks before shipping, and they may even be able to improve or implement their own chain of custody or segregation system, which give you a lot more confidence in the risks relating to mixing. So I guess the message here as well is you can't do a lot of these things without your suppliers. Collaborating with suppliers is key. They have access to the rest of the supply chain. They are potentially closer to the risk, and they will have the necessary language, skills and local knowledge to be able to help you. For example, interpreting documents, potentially even helping you with translation. So a lot of kind of, where you're looking to improve your due diligence, I think quite often the best place to start is supplier training and dialogue with them. So now look at auditing. So auditing can be used in a number of different ways, and I think it's important to understand how you're using or want to use audits to in your due diligence system. So audits can be used to verify the legal conformance of a supply chain, or it can be used to verify the effectiveness of a risk mitigation action, or it might be, one audit might do both of those things. But I think when you think of, it's important to understand the difference between a risk-based approach, which is the EU and UKTR, but then when you're moving into auditing, it then goes into a compliance approach. So once you're there, and you've got your checklist, you're then, in a lot of cases, especially if it's a more formal audit, you're looking at compliance, not risk, and observable events. And what do you do when you find a non-compliance? And also understanding the limitations of an audit, because really, it is a snapshot in time and not everything may be observable in a day or 2 days, and you have to think that some issues relating to illegality, so sort of systemic corruption and governance challenges, you're not likely to be able to pick them up in an audit. So it's just understanding those things and considering them when you kind of decide to initiate an audit. So an audit can include different activities depending on the types of risk you're trying to identify or address. And I think that bit of the sentence is key: identify or address, because you may, I think sometimes there's a operators can see an audit as a mitigation measure, but potentially during an audit you will identify risks. If you're auditing at forest level, you might identify a risk or a non-compliance, and then what do you do with it? Because that audit may, that audit may only identify it, it might not close it. So it's what do you do with the results of the audit? But the audit may help you close risks, but what do you do when you identify them? So I think that's the important thing to bear in mind, that the auditing may be the start of further mitigation measures, depending on what's found. So just going back to what the different activities that may be included within an audit, you may be there to collect documents and review them. So it may have been, you may have a supplier who has just been consistently unable to provide you with the information and documents you need, and it may just be more efficient to just go there, look at them, see what you need to see, and get copies wherever possible, and close that risk that way. Particularly if that supplier is supplying you like a large number of products, it may be much more efficient to do it that way than remotely, and just do everything in one go. There's an audit will, part of the audit is just general observations, but it may also, a good audit would also include interviews to really kind of get into the details of things, and it may also be appropriate that you do stakeholder consultations outside of just the interviews, so wider stakeholders. Things to consider is who should you audit in the supply chain. I think a lot of bigger companies are engaged in first-tier supplier audits, but is that where, and whether or not they include timber legality specific elements of those audits, they may just be wider compliance audits. But is that first-tier supplier, an audit of that first-tier supplier, going to help you, or does it need to be further back in the supply chain, say at a mill or a component factory? And also the number, so it's not just who in the supply chain you should audit, but are there a number of different entities you should be auditing in a given supply chain? And where there's a large number of audits need to take place, then it may become a sampling exercise. What is a sensible sample number, and what is the regularity of that audit that's needed? The other thing, just to say, auditing doesn't have to be by a third party. You can audit your suppliers, but you can also do internal audits. And when I say first party audits here, I mean, I'm mainly thinking of internal audits of your organization and your due diligence system. Then You need to consider the quality of the audit. So, you know, if that's something your staff members are going to do of your suppliers, so you're not relying on a third party, what are their sort of training competency levels to, yeah, and the ability to pick up on certain issues. You know, what are they using to do the audit? Do you have a checklist? And is that, you know, is that sufficient? And then just the last point, you again mentioned this already, consider the ability of an audit to pick up on kind of big issues related to corruption in supply chains in some countries. I think that's everything. Yeah, this is fairly straightforward, but you know, there may become a point when you need to replace your supplier who is, you know, potentially consistently uncooperative or unable, where you're unable to conclude low risk. A good due diligence system will have like an escalation process that enables those in your company who are implementing due diligence to kind of know when you get to that point and be able to raise it, because it may not be the person doing the due diligence in your organization that can make that type of decision. So are they able to raise that, and what's the threshold for that? I've sort of already covered this, but just to push the point once more that supplier cooperation is key. I think, you know, this is all about building relationships with suppliers and getting them on board to help you. Oh, there's some repetition in these slides. I'm going to skip that one. This actually, there's a an article on our website that is a guide to working with suppliers for the EU timber regulation. So do check that out if you want more information. So in summary, risk mitigation is a continual process. It's quite often not a one-off activity, particularly where there is complex issues around risk. So yeah, knowing what your long-term mitigation strategy is important. Unfortunately, it may not be quick or straightforward. And the best mitigation we see is embedded into companies' buying decisions and ways of working, and not at the end of the process. Sometimes I think conducting a risk assessment for all the products that are in scope of the regulation is such a big undertaking for some companies, just because of the number of products and the complexity of those products that they have. Takes up a lot of energy, and understandably so. But you know, we need to get to the mitigation part of the process, and some of that needs to happen upfront when you're kind of selecting your products and designing your products. So that brings me to the end of the mitigation section of the presentation. I'm just going to check how we're doing for time. Okay. Great. We're on time-ish. That's good news at this time of the day. Right. Certification and due diligence. So certification is not a green lane under the EU and UK timber regulation. It does not automatically guarantee low risk, and it does not mean that you don't need to do the due diligence steps of information collection, meeting the minimum information requirements, doing the risk assessment, and where necessary, the mitigation steps. Certified products, certified material is super helpful in a number of ways. It's likely to mean you have better access to the information you're required to have under the regulation. FSC companies FSC certified companies who's supplying certified material are required by FSC to provide that information when requested. So, and that was a communication given by FSC, for example. So, you know, they can't hide behind that certified status. So it should help you, and that information is available in the supply chain as part of the chain of custody process. And it will, in a lot of cases, considerably help you to mitigate the risk, and the risk assessment process does get a little bit easier and less onerous. So the EUTR and the UKTR list requirements for certification schemes to be considered kind of under the regulation, and it gives guidance to operators. So if you go on to the EC website, I've actually got it up on my second screen. There is guidance in on the EC page, European Commission EUTR webpage. There's guidance documents in there about the treatment of, you know, how to treat certified. So do look at that if you need more information. I think one of the challenges is the number of third-party certification schemes out there that exist, and knowing how to treat those. You know, there's the bigger ones out there like FSC and PEFC, but then there's a kind of long tail of different schemes. Some of those that we have listed down the bottom, some of the logos there, and understanding what those different schemes do. So PEFC and FSC are sustainable forest management schemes, and they do include legality within them, and they also have associated chain of custody regulations, requirements and standards. But then there's also other schemes like OLB, which is a legal forest management scheme with chain of custody. And then there's things like Legal Source, which is preferred by Nature's own scheme. That's slightly different in that it's legality only, but then it differs from OLB in that there's a due diligence requirement around it, and it's applicable to different entities in the supply chain, from, you know, importers, traders, producers, and forest entities. So lots of logos, lots of different schemes to consider, and hopefully this presentation will help you know what to do when you're presented with a new scheme, and, you know, is that credible, and how should I treat that in my due diligence system. So this is what the regulation says. Sorry, I'm just moving boxes out the way. Where the operator uses a third-party certification scheme, the EUTR subtext UKTR requires them to evaluate the certification, that the certification scheme covers the applicable legislation as defined by the regulation. So that applicable legislation phrase, take you back to the first presentation of the day, are all those legality criteria covered because different schemes cover different things, and yeah, it's not always a straight overlay of requirements. So then there's a bit more detail there around what the regulation requires you to do. But what the main message is that the regulation requires operators to assess the credibility of a third-party verification scheme. So if you're going to rely on it, you have to understand how its credibility, its scope, and how it's helping you address risk. And to do that, operators may use the following questions. So, are all the requirements under Article 4 fulfilled? And that relates to the applicable legislation and that definition. Is the third-party verification scheme compliant with international and European standards, e.g. the relevant ISO guides and ISIL codes? For the most part, the bigger schemes will, but in the sort of longer tail of schemes that maybe are newer schemes or small kind of national schemes, that becomes more of a question mark in understanding how they were developed. Then there's this third point is, I think, the really important one is, are there any substantiated reports about possible shortcomings or problems of the third-party verification scheme in that country? So that might be more, so if the first point is around the scope of the scheme and whether it covers all the requirements that the EUTR and UKTR request it to cover, that bullet point refers to its implementation and like how strong it is in ensuring that those requirements are implemented by a certification, a certificate holder, and that's the tricky bit. And it will differ from country to country, and yeah, more on that in a minute. Are the third parties that perform the checks and verifications independently accredited, certificate organizations? So again, that comes back to the scheme and yeah, how those certification bodies are kind of governed, and how is it ensured that those certification bodies are performing a good job. Any issues identified through that process, then you as the operator have to address them and close them out. So when it comes to evaluating schemes, so when I refer to the points, 1 and 2 and 4, Preferred by Nature has conducted evaluations of the different standards to help, because that's something that actually, if you're going to do it properly, is quite a technical exercise, and not easy to do. So through Life Funding, we have done that, and we are working on more now. So on our website, we've already done PEFC and FSC. And then because PEFC effectively accredits national standards, through the PEFC one, we've done the Malaysian national standard and surf law, which is the Brazilian national standard. So feel free to have a look at those. What we also have, if you wanted to perform your own certificate scheme evaluation on a scheme that we haven't evaluated already, we have developed a standard for evaluating schemes which is available for you to use, and a corresponding checklist which you can fill in as you go. And hopefully that will guide you through being able to evaluate the scheme effectively, should you need to. So the scheme evaluations that we've done and cover an evaluation of the definition of legality, whether that complies with the regulation. It looks at the chain of custody requirements and sort of the traceability controls in place. And it also looks at scheme quality assurance requirements. So sort of how is that scheme monitored and implemented so that it's robust and credible. But what it doesn't cover, and this goes back to my previous point, is that more difficult third bullet point of the evaluation of the scheme's performance in a specific geography. Purely because of the difficulties, as you can understand, with doing that. So, you know, the application of all these schemes by numerous different certification bodies in particular countries is just would be very difficult to do, and also come with sensitivities in itself. So the what you need to do for that, to fulfill that part of the requirement, is monitor publicly available reports raising substantiated concerns. So we know that there's a few out there, and we, you know, for example, you know, there's fairly well documented evidence to show that there is the risk of false claims related, false certification claims in countries such as China. So, you know, what do you need to do to ensure that your product hasn't got a false claim? And that might involve not only checking the certificate codes and the scope and the validity of your direct supplier, but it may need you to go a bit further back and understand the certification status of your sub suppliers to potentially mitigate that risk. There's other countries, for example, Ukraine. You know, there's been a number of high-profile reports around the ability of FSC to address some of the kind of corruption and illegality in the Ukraine's forest sector. So those are the sorts of things you need to keep an eye out, and it's the sort of thing that, you know, there may over a course of months, maybe things don't change, but every now and again, you know, a new report or what have you will come about that may mean there's a step change in how you need to view something in a particular country. So you may not need to do it super regularly, but just make sure you're plugged into those channels so that you find out about that when something does change. Then there's just a few things as well around understanding certification claims that I'm going to, just seen the time, just touch on here. I'll try and speed up a little bit. So understanding claims is important. So, you know, there's FSC 100%. So that means 100 material that is, all of the material is certified, and that moves through the supply chain and comes out with a FSC 100% claim at the end of it. That's straightforward. But then it gets slightly more complicated when you're looking at mixed claims, and understanding those claims are important. So you can have mixed claims on material that comes from FSC certified forests, but it also may come from FSC controlled wood certified forest, which is, you know, still a credible scheme, but it is a lesser set of requirements, and understanding kind of the impact that has. And then there's this another way to hold mixed claims would be that somewhere in the supply chain, someone has done due diligence and controlled the wood there. And it's a kind of a strange thing to concept in some ways, but that wood has come from a non-certified forest. But an entity in the supply chain has done a risk assessment and has a due diligence system in place, and that a non-certified material can enter an FSC supply chain in that way. So in that sense, you are relying on someone or an organization to do adequate due diligence. And sometimes when we look at risks around certification, in some cases, it's related to that type of claim and that due diligence process. Right. And then just finally, I think we're coming to the end of the last few slides. So the key thing that you need to do, sorry, I'm just being told that there might be having sound issues. Chloe, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, just wanted to check. So when you're sourcing certified, one of the key things you need to do is check that at a minimum, your first tier supplier has a valid certificate, and you can do that by the public database for that scheme. I think most of the common schemes have a public database, and we recommend relying on the database rather than a paper certificate that you may have been sent electronically, just because you may miss a certificate being terminated or suspended if you rely on the paper version. So we always say, look at the status on the database, because that's going to be the most up-to-date source of information. Secondly, you need to check the scope of your supplier's certificate. Are the products you are sourcing included in that scope? Always check the relevant sales or transport documents between you and your first tier supplier, because that's the way of telling whether the material you have been sent is certified. You have to remember that a certified entity can sell both certified and non-certified products. And I think this happens a lot less now, but in sort of the beginnings of the EUTR, we'd often see companies that had they had a chain of custody certificate from their supplier, but that doesn't tell you whether your material is certified. So always important to check that. And just on that bullet point there, to check the claim on those documents, so whether it's mix or 100%. So here's just a screenshot of how you do it. The FSC database, there's the link there you can follow, and then click certificate search. You can search by your supplier's name or your certificate code. One thing I would say is the status on the second red arrow, or third red arrow, second red arrow on the second image. Sometimes you can put the name of your supplier in there and then have a panic because they don't appear, but change the status to all statuses so you can see terminated or suspended certificates. and then you might find your supplier appears there. If your supplier appears as suspended or terminated, that doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't mean that something's gone wrong or there's a big problem and they've been disassociated or something. It may just mean that then they're no longer certified, or they're changing certification bodies or something like that. So understanding why they may be suspended or terminated is important. The other thing is by the time you're checking, the material may have been sent to you certified, and their certificate may have been valid at the time. But if there's a time lag in the process, and you're not checking that document until a few months later, particularly if it's not your first tier supplier, and this was something that your sub supplier or something has sent to you, as long as that material came to you or was used, either came to you or their supplier, if it's not to you, that their certificate scope was valid at that point, that's okay. But you need to look at when the validity expired. So it's not necessarily a big problem. So then just to sum up, we have a number of certification webinars happening as part of the LIFE project. So they're happening in a number of different countries, in a number of different languages. So if you're interested, you can sign up to these, but also, if any of your suppliers would benefit from this, please do spread the word. These are completely free to access and are all, they're funded through the project, and with meeting the project objectives of raising awareness and improving the implementation of the EUTR. So please do let your suppliers know if any of these apply to them. The content will be the same in the different languages. So if you attend one, you probably won't want to attend another. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. And I believe we now have I'll just check the agenda, but I think we have a Q&A session.
No, we have Chloe next. So it's 3:30 now. So we've got introducing available tools.
Great.
Chloe.
Okay. So we're doing Q&A in half an hour.
Yes, that's right.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll take over for the last presentation of the day. Okay, hang on. So I need to be presenter. And okay, so my screen, yes, that hopefully should be okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So let's move on. Okay, so to wrap up, I think it's important to share a few available tools to help operators do all the steps. We're aware that it's super challenging, resource consuming in terms of time, financial resources, etc. So the idea is to share with you a few of the tools that are available. We're not going to be able to list them all, but we're going to mention a few tools that are here to help you build or develop your due diligence system, tools that are here to help you identify applicable legislation and controllable risks, and finally, tools that can help you cross-check information on your specific supply chains. Right, so let's start with tools that can help you strengthen your due diligence system. So let me walk you through our legal source standard first, because there's we have a lot of questions about that. So we have a due diligence standard. So we have developed a set of requirements that apply to a strong due diligence system, and those requirements align with the EUTR and therefore UKTR. So basically, this set of requirements is within a group within a standard and can be used by any supply chain level entity that is doing due diligence, including operators. And it is possible to get certified against this standard, but it's not something that's mandatory. Like, anyone can use this checklist and those requirements to strengthen their due diligence, right? So that's one thing that is there. And we have developed supporting tools to help companies implement these standards and those requirements. So we have a toolkit that's available that is populated with templates and guidance documents, and I'm going to mention them in a moment. And we have our sourcing hub platform, which we have also introduced. So this is the whole galaxy of our own contribution to due diligence. Yeah, so those documents are freely available for everyone, and we have an open source policy. So our toolkit is available for download from the sourcing hub. You can either choose to download all the documents together, or you can download them one by one, depending on your specific needs. We have 3 guidance documents. We have a due diligence guidance document that normally would be repeating what we've been saying today, but that can be another source of information that's useful. We have a specific due diligence guidance for forest managers that might not be relevant for operators, but it's still there. And we have a risk specification guidance that I think we've mentioned. So that's if you want to use a country risk assessment yourself, you can use this to guide you. Maybe more important, I don't know, more important, but also important are our templates. So we have a whole list of ready-made template that you can download and use, twist, transform, adjust, just read them for inspiration, use it any way you feel fit. So we have a due diligence standard manual, let's say, standard policy too. We have a few Excel data sheets. So it's about supply chain mapping, supplier listing, and I think recording risk assessment. Yeah, so those are basic templates. They're not perfect, they won't fit everyone, but it can be a good basis to start working on something that's already there. Other templates that we have are a supplier information letter, a risk identification checklist. That one is for individual supply chains. We've already mentioned our certification scheme evaluation template, but we also have a supplier audit report that one might be interesting for you to use, and a product statement. So feel free to dig into that and take whatever can help you strengthen your due diligence system. What else? We're not the only one. So basically, working with a monitoring organization, whichever it is, can be a good idea if for any operators that feel a bit overwhelmed by the obligations to develop a due diligence system. So you can use an existing due diligence system if you decide to work with a monitoring organization. And in that case, you will have a ready-made due diligence system with a smaller amount of adjustment to do to fit your organization. And this due diligence system will be reviewed and updated by someone else than you. Using dedicated IT systems that are specifically designed to map supply chains, handle and record risk assessment can be a big plus if you have the means to do so. It might be more designed to bigger companies, but now that it's out there, there are, I think, several alternatives to choose from. And several organizations that are working on specific IT systems. But if you don't have the means or to have an IT system, I think better tapping into the potential of software that might already be in your computers is sometimes something that's there, that's available, that's relatively low cost. So Excel, for instance, is a very powerful tool, and the functionalities of those softwares that we all have are sometimes underused. So feel free to take a little bit of time to explore the functionalities of the softwares that you might already have that might really help you, especially if you have a lot of products, that might really help you keep an eye on your risk assessments, your data collection, your recording of risk assessment, conclusion, risk mitigation action. If you have a lot of products, the amount of data that you will have and you need to record and keep track of can get pretty out of hand if you don't have good recording tools. So even if you don't have a dedicated IT system, there's tools that can help you do that and really keep an eye on this whole due diligence process. So consider low-cost softwares that might help you. And finally, the last point about strengthening a due diligence system is probably having a serious evaluation process, a regular evaluation process, asking yourselves what works well, what could be improved. And this evaluation process could be internal or external, right? So, so that's something that's quite important to have to make sure that not only do your procedures match the UTR requirements, but that the actual implementation of the procedures also live up to the requirements of the regulation. So that's for the due diligence tools. Now, we've mentioned it a little bit in the last Q&A. So yeah, it is challenging when you're doing the risk assessment step to really know and understand the legislation in the country of harvest, and to understand what are the risks in this country. That's super challenging. There are tools out there to help you do that and give you information about country legality and country level of risk. So our Sourcing Hub platform is specifically designed to do that. So we, as you can see, maybe, let me get the pointer. We are developing risk assessment for several commodities, but where our stronger area of expertise is really timber, but we are working to expand to beef, soy, and palm oil, I think, yeah. So basically, the idea is that this platform is gathering timber legality risk assessment for as many timber producing countries as possible. And it is designed to provide information about risks on compliance with timber-related legislation by countries, knowing that our definition of timber-related legislation is in line with the EUTR. So it is based on the 5 broad categories and is even detailing further what's inside those 5 broad categories. So you can, when you access this page, and you'll have the link here when you receive the training materials, or you can just Google it. You can select a country by clicking on the map or entering the name of the country here. Might be useful for smaller countries that are very small on the map. And you'll get to the country page. On the country page, you'll see a number of things. So I'm just going to walk you through just to give you an idea of what you will find. You will find a general risk score. Be careful, the higher the score, the lower the risk, and the other way around. So the lower the score, the higher the risk. You will find an overview of the country here. So that's what appears when you open the country page. On the top left corner, you will be able to download a full PDF, the full PDF of the risk assessment. They're quite lengthy, but that's where you'll find all the information. You can also scroll down, and by scrolling down, you will see summaries of the main information, let's say, on risk assessment. So you'll have on the top of the page a few boxes with important high-level information. So the CPI score, which is normally up to date, whether there's bans and restrictions in place in this country, whether there's armed conflict linked to the timber industry, whether there's CITES species, and whether there's certified forests in this country. And scrolling further down, you will be able to access a few information on information gathering. So that normally will tell you the legality documents of this country. risk assessment, which will summarize the main legality risk for the 5 big categories that have been detected in this country. And normally they're detailed enough so you understand really what the risk is. And finally, you'll have a few guidance on risk mitigation. So that's all you can find on the Sourcing Hub. We're trying to keep it up to date as much as we can. It's quite a huge task. So if you ever see something that's not up to date, you can. There's no screenshot, but there's a feedback field at the end at the bottom of the page. So any country you see is missing something, please provide your feedback. Any country that is missing for which you have a need to get information on, also please provide feedback and requests. We see this as a platform that's supposed to be interactive and supposed to be improved with feedbacks from users. And we are in the process of making it a bit more user-friendly. So hopefully in the upcoming month, this interface that I'm showing you will slightly change and you will normally access the risks in a bit of a easier way and more clear way. So that's the goal for this year and the upcoming month. We're not the only one doing that. So I'm just going to share a few other examples. FSC Centralized National Risk Assessment can also be used. They are normally quite aligned with our Sourcing Hub risk assessment. So normally you should find the same identification of risk in both platforms. And there's also a number of other sources that you can use. There's the Timber Trade Portal. There's the Australian government that's also done some country-specific guidelines. BV Rio has also developed practical guides. I think WCMC also has a few country profile. I don't think it's in that list. And then you also have other sources of information. So Client Earth has a forest logbook, which is aggregating different sources of information by country. So that can be a good entry point. If you're sourcing timber from African countries mainly, the Open Timber Portal is a tool that has been designed so that forest management unit can directly upload their forest documents and you can access them directly. Yeah, and the FAO also has a quite comprehensive database of legislation. So it's only the first step of identifying what is the legislation in place. It doesn't go up to what are the risks that this legislation is not enforced, but that might be helpful in particular for countries where you might be struggling to find information on. So yeah, that's just a non-exhaustive list of other sources of information. If you're using those other sources of information, make sure that all the EUTR legal categories are indeed considered, right? Make sure that you're not using a source of information that is assessing for legal categories and not considering, for instance, the payment of harvest fees and taxes, because that you'd be missing something. If there's no risk assessment available for you to gather information on the harvest country, in theory, this step must be carried out by the operator implementing due diligence, right? So we also have developed a risk specification guideline should you have to do this process yourself. These guidelines are helping you identifying the steps that should be undertaken to do this kind of exercises of identifying the applicable legislation, the legal authorities, the legally required documents, the different sources of information, and based on all that, concluding on a risk determination. Basically, we have a scale of how it's helping you determine which kind of illegalities can lead to specified risk at the country level, right? And when a specific legal category can be concluded as low risk of being not non-complied with, right? So this tool is out there should you need to do that yourself. Again, if there's countries that are not on the Sourcing Hub, we are keen to identify the needs and and to prioritize in terms of like countries where there's a lot of requests to have these kind of free timber legality risk assessment available. So that's for the risks at the country level. And finally, some tools to help you cross-check information on your specific supply chains. So there's a few elements that you can quite simply verify when assessing individual supply chains. So the first one being the distribution of species. So checking the coherence between the country of harvest that has been declared and the species that has been declared is an important step. Checking trade routes can sometimes be quite important to validate the supply chain. Sometimes you already, if you're very familiar with the timber industry, you might not need to, you might know already, but sometimes on specific products or supply chains products you might not be super familiar with. There's databases and platforms which can help you having an idea about usual trade routes and trade trends. Document validity, we've mentioned that already. There's no centralized list of available resources, but that's something that can be used. Certification claims and certificate validity, we've also mentioned that, and forest-related documents sometimes can also be accessed freely online. So just to give you a small selection, again, it's just a selection because there's really a lot out there. The OTP, Open Timber Portal, is more centered around the Congo Basin countries and can help you access forestry documents directly. Species distribution can be consulted in the IUCN Red List, but also other websites such as QS Plants of the World Online, or the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or U4Gen. But those are just a selection. There's many more. And for species distribution, sometimes it's easier to just plug in a search engine, the species name, and then write distribution, and then go to the image search, and you will see maps of species distribution popping up. So you can even, in one site, see different maps from different sources and have a good view of this species distribution. A few websites for trade routes. So Chatham House is a pretty good one where you can filter by forestry products, and you can even, I think, filter down by types of timber. The FAO also has some trade data, and STIX, Sustainable Timber Information Exchange, also displays some trade routes. So yeah, just a few examples of useful platforms that are free to use. Yeah, there's no harm in using them to cross-check information. It might not always give you the answer you want, but just know that they are out there. And last but not least, that's like probably the trickiest part is, okay, I received documents, but they're in Chinese or Russian, a language that I don't understand and that I cannot even read because the alphabet of, yeah, the signs used is just not, I can't decipher it. So yeah, there's no magical recipe. Make use as much as you can of online translation tools, which are quite good and free. Know that whenever you're provided with PDFs or images, you can use character recognition on your computer. So that means that your computer will scan the documents, knowing that it's the photo of a text. And if you tell your computer the language that the document is in, it might be able to, from an image, give you a text that you can then plug in the translation tools. I think you can even know with smartphones, sometimes now you can take a photo and it will come up automatically. It will translate you the documents. So be mindful of those tools that are out there. Know that sometimes you'll need a paying version of PDF readers to access this OCR function. So if you're not able to do that, maybe look into upgrading the version of your software. And sometimes you have to manually, so here you have 2 screenshots. So it will really depend on which software you're operating. You might have to manually go and tell your software to do character recognition, and you might need to tell the software the language that the document is in. Yeah, so be mindful that those tools are out there. You can also request your supplier to do some level of translation for you. Of course, that entails that you have some confidence in what they're telling you. It might be the case that you need to do spot checks on the document that they're translating for you. So you can use a combination of solutions to overcome this translation obstacle, right? So you might tell your supplier to do the translation and let them know that you'll do random spot check on the document, so that better not translate wrong information for you. So yeah, so that's a challenging part, but yeah, there's tools out there and ways to deal with that. And yeah, just to quickly conclude on that presentation, talking about us again. So we've mentioned a lot of areas of risk assessment and a lot of steps, a lot of tools. So just to maybe wrap up, summarizing how Preferred by Nature can help you. We're not the only one service provider out there, but I cannot talk for everyone. So just to mention the areas in which we can help operators or other entities which are interested in looking into timber legality. So the first area would be providing certification services. So we can certify a due diligence system against our legal source standard. And we can also be used as a monitoring organization also on the basis of this standard, which is a due diligence system, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing, which is a bit more complex and can really be a different thing, is our tailored solutions. So basically, what we want to do is help wherever there's a need, right? So we can help we can help operators work on commitments and policy developments. So defining a policy, conducting a gap analysis to see where there's gaps and where improvement can be undertaken, designing action plans. We can also work with system development, so helping writing down and improving procedures, tailoring tools and systems, and ensuring quality management of the whole system. We can deliver training, as you're seeing right now, and we can deliver really tailored training, so be it in terms of level of the training, but also language and audience. One thing that we've been doing quite a lot lately is, for instance, providing for trainings in Chinese to Chinese suppliers, so they understand better what are the UTR and why they're being asked a lot of questions. So that's how we can really tailor this. Supply chain engagement, so we can also assist in mapping supply chain and ensuring traceability of timber products, validating a supply chain, conducting risk assessment on specific supply chains or a whole set of supply chains or all of your supply chains. Spot checks, so independent verification, whether at the forest level or supply chain level, that's also something we can do and assist. And finally, ongoing advisory, so we can also have kind of an ongoing support, which can be giving you clarification, interpretation, keeping an eye on what's going on, upcoming public reports and stuff like that. So yeah, so if you have any questions on that, we are available to discuss. And I think that's the end of it.